Okay, we're recording now. So, Cliff, thank you for coming to the channel. And I've had lots of requests that watch my show. Oh, please get Cliff High on the channel. He's a wealth of knowledge. So here we are. We've been going back and forth on emails, trying to get a schedule pinned down. But thank you very much for coming onto the channel and talking to me. And if you can maybe introduce yourself to the ones that don't know you, and maybe some personal aspects that you might want to share.
Basically, I'm just an old retired guy, but I've been doing software engineering, programming, and technology all the way back to the burgeoning of the telephony industry in the USA, which was admittedly we could describe it as being the jump-off point for true technology here, right? Because it was our telephony industry that was locking us into the old dial-ups and so on. And then we went digital, and I was right there when all that happened. I was part of the team that came up with SS7, which is the signal shifting layer within the telephony network that allows a thing called the billing and rating channel. And without that, we couldn't run this telephone call, you couldn't run the internet or anything, because basically it creates two channels for every telephone call, one of which keeps track of information about the other one, which has the telephone call itself going through. So you know the duration, which hops it made, all of the details. The metadata layer about the telephone call allows the UDP layer, the MAC layer, and all the things that support the internet as we know it. And so that all came about as a result of this stuff called SS7. And that was the first team I participated in that had patents in software and digital stuff. And so I've been doing this since the 80s and just have something of an accumulated knowledge on it. Along the way, I've run into cancer 3 times, and I've been able to apply analytical skills to dealing with the cancer. Now, 2 of them were rather obvious, one of which required a complete radical mastectomy, and the other I cured myself because I wasn't going to have any more of that surgery business. And it was a big giant skin cancer on the top of my head. And I cured that with some extracts of a particular kind of a relative of the eggplant that comes from Australia. They put it in this product called Curaderm, and they use it on cows over there, and it causes big lumps to drop off. And I had a dog that had a lumpy kind of a skin cancer, so I put some on there, and it caused that to drop off. So when it came time for me to decide, let this physician's assistant with short, pudgy little fingers and shaky hands excise a big area out of my scalp or try cow stuff, I thought, I'll try the cow stuff. And within a week, it was gone. So when I went back to the doctor's office, they were like really irritated because they were all set to bill me for, the physician's assistant and 3 other people to assist in removing a palm-sized area out of the top of my scalp, and it wasn't there. And I just went back to get confirmation that it was indeed cancerous, because indeed they'd done a biopsy and it was. So I knew that was gone. But in any event, so as a result of, the 3rd cancer was one of these, they used to be, well, I don't want to say used to be, they're still very typical, okay? Our cancer rates have not changed. If you look at it statistically, the creation of the scoping techniques down either part of the alimentary canal, coloscopies, or trachea examinations for cancer have not reduced the amount of deaths from cancer, and there's been no bloom of cancer discovery. All right, so it turns out that when you go and have a colonoscopy, there's a statistical, validated by insurance companies now since 1979, there's a statistical likelihood that the operator will find at between 2 and 11 precancerous polyps that are removed. And in no way does that alter that person's relationship with the potential for colon cancer. If they're going to get debilitating colon cancer, they'll still have it. Even if they get colonoscopies every year, it'll still show up. It's simply an additional risk in this. And in a statistical level, it hasn't reduced death from colon cancer, nor has it reduced, nor was there a bloom, a discovery bloom of colon cancers at large levels in lots of people as a result of colonoscopies. It just didn't happen. And so what we find when we get into that, because I had colon cancer, very large colon cancer that was undiagnosed for over 30 years, but I can actually tell you that it started growing on me in 1983. And I know this, and so it was finally removed in 2018. And this is not atypical, it turns out. There's any number of people that are men, usually, that reach the age after 65, sometime after 65, and they will be discovered with large colon cancers, usually at the point of death. They're usually discovered by a blockage, a bleeding rupture that is uncontrollable, these kind of things. And it was basically that same sort of way for me. The cancers alter how you live because of trying to live with them, especially undiagnosed. And I spent hundreds of thousands of dollars of my own money, as well as potentially millions of dollars of insurance money, looking for whatever it was that was wrong with me over a course of 30 years. But in order to be able to continue to take care of myself, the rest of my family, which included my brother and my ailing mother and so on, I turned to the only source of relief that I could find, which was what we can describe as basically indigenous medicine, because it goes beyond the idea of simply herbs and that sort of thing, right? And so I became very adept at the various different forms: Ayurveda, traditional Chinese medicine, South American curandero, procedures, etc., philosophies, and all of that kind of a deal. And I was able to keep myself going. During the course of time of the cancer, I established a very successful business, got patents on my own, worked as an international consultant, flew all around the planet and solved problems for people, and yada, yada, yada kind of stuff, right? And but during the course of that, it was like I actually became under pressure and reluctantly pretty good at understanding the biology of humans and how we interact with substances from our environment. So what we can think of really as all medicines, not allopathic chemicals, but all medicines, and I have a bigger definition for that, really are epigenetic triggers, okay? Because it's only the body that ever heals itself, and we provide substances to signal those parts of the body to trigger for healing when we can become consciously aware that there's a need for that. Sort of makes sense, that definition?
Yeah. No, people don't realize that it's not just genetics. It's a big part of this is the epigenetics. You can have the right code, right, in your genome, but the stuff's turned off that should be
no
on.
One flips the switch, right.
And so it's the methylization. For people that don't know, there's methylization that takes place on our DNA that allows for certain genes to be transcribed or not transcribed. So in certain cells, when they differentiate, they have to have these different switches on and off. That's what helps to differentiate these cells. When they come from a stem cell and then they start to differentiate, the epigenetics of that lineage slowly changes. And that's how you have, let's say, an embryonic stem cell turn into a cardiac cell eventually, as it spreads out. Right. But people don't realize this. And then in cancer, unfortunately, a lot of crazy stuff happens. It's a chaotic system, really. And there's lots of divisions. There's lots of breakage points within the genome. Certain genes are turned on, certain genes are turned off.
It affects your whole being. Yeah. No, it was stripping calcium from me, strip muscle mass at the end. It's very predictable as to how it goes along. From a metadata level, I presented 9 times to physicians out of maybe 40 or 50 times in the last few years, where I had, 7 out of the 11 you know, critical kinds of symptoms for cancer, and it was just missed. But it all, and I didn't pick up on it at the time in these last years because it alters your thinking, right? It truly alters your consciousness. Your relationship of your consciousness to your body is strained. And as I got closer and closer to death, which occurred for me on July 13th, Friday the 13th, 2018, in the course of a 40-mile hospital or ride to the hospital with an obstruction in the bowel and a cancerous mass that was 5 centimeters by 5 centimeters by 4 centimeters thick. So as big as my palm and nearly 2 inches thick. At that point, it dawned on me in those, you know, let's say the final few hours that how my thinking had been affected because I was actually sort of coming out of some parts of that. And I knew that I would end up with relief that day. Either there would be some solution or I would be dead. And either way, that was fine with me. The solution, both were adequate solutions to the problem because the amount of pain and all of this kind of stuff and the way that that actually twists your thinking. But it's more than that because it alters the biochemistry of the mind. Very difficult time to keep your mental faculties aligned the way you might want to. But during the process of this, one thing I noticed over the course of, say, the last 6 years of it was an increasing ability to become very sensitive to molecular changes, right? So I could, for instance, not knowing I had cancer, I could, but knowing that my testosterone was falling, I could go and take, and I tried perhaps 30 or 40 different formula for herbal formula for boosting testosterone. Some of them I know to be anti-cancer because as soon as I would take them that night, I would go through agony, absolute agony, maybe even leading to bleeding from the, you know, through the bowels, right? And that would sort of clear up a little bit the next few days. And at that time in your thinking, you put it down to the substance itself, not what the substance is doing to something that has already previously invaded your body, right? And it was during this final period there that I came to an understanding that's now been reinforced with all of this virus business. Because if we look at all of the 3.2 billion base pair DNA constructors in our body, there's only like 1.5% that are actually coding proteins, right? And so that, but 99.99999% of all of allopathic medicine focuses on those 1.5% of coding DNA, and they ignore the rest of it. Most of, or not most of, but numerically a large percentage of which is actually viri. And so my thinking about this whole thing ever since back in December has been systematically stepwise refinement led to the conclusion that the way to approach health that way is to not only try and boost that 1.5% of the whole mass that is encoding my DNA, but to also provide my body stuff that will able to trigger epigenetic responses, not only in my body, but within the other critters that are in the body. Because they're as susceptible to epigenetic triggers as my own DNA, RNA complex.
Okay, just one is a personal thing, and another that's on my side, and the other is just a quick question about what you've read. My brother passed away from heart disease back in 2010 on July 13th.
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah.
No, so and he what it was is it runs on my mother's side. So a lot of the males pass away between 35 to 45 if they fall in the risk, category, the high carbohydrate,
right.
Problem there. So my brother was drinking a lot of pop, like a 2-liter pop,
yeah.
and he was he was eating a lot of white bread, and it was just huge carbohydrates,
sugars and so on.
And it gets the inflammation. Your insulin level spikes. You get the inflammation, then it's starting to deposit some fat that's in your bloodstream, and it's creating the plaques. So a lot of people think, oh, you need to just reduce your cholesterol. No, you need to reduce your inflammation.
Yeah.
It's the inflammation that does the depositing.
And also the
So
understanding of the numerics that are provided by allopathic medicine are frequently very wrong. So I have
yeah,
it,
and
you know, every time I get checked now, I have very high cholesterol, but you need cholesterol to make the appropriate amount of vitamin D.
exactly.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
my father used to work for AstraZeneca. He retired from AstraZeneca. So, you know, he was a drug salesman. And, you know, he has slight high blood pressure, nothing like what was happening on my mother's side. But he's been taking Crestor for the last 15 years. And I've noticed in the last 6 months that he's not thinking as sharply as he
yeah.
used to.
Yeah.
My dog passed away in 2014, I think. He still thought my dog was alive. I have a new dog, but I mean, he
Sure.
still thought my original dog was still alive. And I was like, Dad, I mean, Puglet died
That's
a long
the
time ago.
right. That's that aspect they call sundowning. Okay, the inability to connect to time and or to connect memories appropriately to time in
Yeah.
relation to the present now. It's very complex. My mother went through it in the last 3 or 4 years of her life with Alzheimer's. Um, there are things you can do about it, and there's the
Well, I'm trying to
appropriate.
convince him to get off of the Crestor.
That's for one, because that's just like the other Lipitors and all of those,
Right.
and it leads to the fissuring in the brain. And the repair for that appears to be peptides in the form of I'm trying to think, seralutin and or endolutin, which are Russian peptides that are specific for passing the triple B barrier and getting in and helping the brain to repair. And they've actually shown promise in filling in, so to speak, causing the fissures of the brain to be vacated, not by actually putting material in there, but actually, you know, plumping up the rest of the brain. So that there are some things you can do. See, I got really good about this because my brother was a total paranoid schizophrenic and died at a young age, 2008. And basically it was up to me to take care of him, my wife. So all these different people have had different conditions, and I became something of a I mean, biology never really appealed to me that much. I was an oceanographer at one point, you know, going that path, right? Physical
I always
oceanography,
wanted, when I
chemical.
was a little kid, I wanted to be a marine biologist. This
Yeah,
was like
oh,
when
it's
I was
cool as hell.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Not a lot of money in it, but
It's,
at the moment, but yeah, it's fascinating.
Jacques Cousteau was the one that turned me on to biology, really, you know, and
Yeah,
then, you know, in the ocean you
yeah.
know, with this, you know, looking at the different, you know, species that are in the ocean. I mean, it was just fascinating.
It's you know, the biology is really cool. I can see why Earth would be attractive to other kinds of species. It's because of the plethora of life forms
Right.
here. But it's interesting about the Crestor and the allopathic approach to things, because we may be looking at the intrusion of social patterns at a very significant level in what we would think of as the individual disease process, as well as the progresses of diseases through our social order. You know, because in essence, these days it's like, well, what if you had a disease that showed up and it seemed to be specific to patterns, you know, like cruise ships. People who didn't go on cruise ships didn't get the disease. Like, what was it before? There was a virus that they used to have in the cruise ship vents. I can't think of the name of it at the moment. It was a rhinovirus, I think. Uh,
Well, I know that a few years ago there
oh,
was
Legionnaires, Legionnaires.
Legionnaire's disease. Yeah.
Right, a retrovirus, right. And so you're really not at risk of exposure of that. It's not a disease per se of the environment. It's a disease of specific environments. And if you happen to have lifestyle qualifiers, like you went to cruise ships or you worked in office buildings with these large style, you know, ventilation systems, then you were susceptible to this disease. And so but people that didn't weren't, and it didn't transmit very well outside of those environments. There's actually a curious connection to the COVID thing as well, because early in the process in Wuhan, there was this and also the thought process flipped over to Hong Kong. There was this big deal about whether or not the pipes in the building were the cause of the spread of the disease. And people went to some great lengths in Wuhan to stuff up and barrier the pipes between their apartment and the ones above and below. And they may well have been correct, because there's always a sweat layer. And that sweat layer, of course, undoubtedly transmitted virus.
Right. Quick question. Did you ever have the opportunity to read, or maybe I'd like to know what's your opinion of Christopher Hitchens? Because I find Christopher Hitchens actually pretty interesting as a philosopher and how he articulates the argument, even though I may not agree with some of the things that he was with it, but the way he's articulating the argument is very interesting, and his debating skills is just
superb.
But he passed away from cancer. It was esophageal cancer, which ran in the family, but it was exacerbated with his drinking. Right. And smoking, but he dies from esophageal cancer, and right before he's passing away, he's writing a book called Mortality. Did you ever happen to read that book? It's a fascinating book about individuals going through cancer, and you can see his style of writing, where he kind of roughs out each chapter, and then he goes back and tries to fill in the detail. But what's weird is that as you're getting closer and closer to the end of the book, it's only 6 chapters. As you're getting closer and closer to the end of the book, the last 2 chapters, you can almost see that his body is starting to deteriorate, because he hasn't filled in the detail. And it's almost like he's slowly drifting away. Right. And it's a very powerful book for people that are going through, a very serious illness to read.
Yeah. Another one is Solzhenitsyn's Cancer Ward. Okay, because he came out of that testicular cancer, and in there he called that same thing, which I adopted it. It was a process of setting down the bucket. Okay, and it comes to this idea that when they were in the cancer ward there in Siberia, they had to participate in the chores. And so they would do the mopping and this kind of thing, right? And as the illness took him over, he had to let go of things. He had to shed things in his mind, because there was less energy for him to be able to do that. And one of them was remembering where he had set down the bucket. And so he then discovered, as part of the process of the disease and the trigger for the disease, and what let him know he was actually curing himself from the disease with this process he undertook, was that he could, when he got into the disease part, he suddenly dawned on him that, he can't bother to remember where he set the bucket. He'll just have to go and look for it each time. And so, it took a lot of time and trouble, but it was much less time and trouble shuffling his body around to look for the bucket than trying to remember where he had last put it. And yet that being able to remember where everything was in his life was a key element of who he was prior to getting into the disease, right? Very much like Hitchens and his writing ability. And so in the process here, Solzhenitsyn goes on, he does this, goes through this process of a cure, or treatment, whatever you want to say. And he notices that he's coming back to the world because one day he knew right where to go. He didn't have to try and shuffle around for the bucket. He remembered where he had put it. And from that day on, the rest of his book changes, because it's, the descent down, the descent into hell, and then the recovery of the hero's journey out from that point, as he discovers that he can remember once again, and it doesn't take him that effort. And I went through that. As I was going through the cancer in the last few years, I'd gotten used in the last 6 years to having 3 hours a day I could devote to work. And then maybe I could bumble through 4 or 5 hours a day, keeping the household going. My wife being mobility challenged and unable to help much, right? And so, and then it got really acute, and I lost my ability at work to do all of the necessary maintenance on all of my code and software and stuff, and I just let it go. And so for the last year or so, I didn't maintain my system, and it gradually, everything got skewed off. Technically because of this other technical issue, and I never bothered to try and recover it or repair it from there because I did not have the energy, because it was down to like maybe an hour and a half a day I could devote to work, and maybe 2 or 3 hours a day to the keeping of the house going, and then the rest of the day basically to sheer exhaustion and mental incapacity to think your way out of the exhaustion. And so that was the biggest robbery, was the stealing of the mind. And I fully understand what he went through in those last days. I'm determined not to go out that way.
It's interesting, how the complex systems, no matter what you're looking at, either New York City, which is a complex system, the human body, or whatever, the ocean, how entropy, the relationship to entropy is, and when you have to put energy in to keep it organized. But there is a point where things can get disorganized very quickly, and it just drifts off into,
you don't have the energy to recover. Correct.
Right.
Correct.
Like how the human body, it has to maintain ATP. But if it doesn't maintain ATP, lots of other processes start to break down.
Right.
Yeah,
Brain.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. That goes first. 25% of all of that whole process is devoted to keeping the brain fired just at basic levels. So yeah. It's really interesting. It's a nice metaphor, or a paradigm for approaching things. That's because I look at the body as a complex system, not necessarily 100% my own, so to speak, right? In the sense that I have a virome and a biome that are in me. They need to cooperate. They need to be there and be healthy. But it's not like I can order them around or do something to massage, or it's not like our systems are set up to massage their actions the way that our systems are set up to try and massage the actions of the liver or the spleen or something along those lines in order to create an effect. We don't actually try to do that. We try and kill off the microvitae rather than make them do our will.
Right. We're research out there is just starting in quote mainstream research about understanding the biome. I would think that the homeopathics were a little bit more leading in this regard, understanding that probiotics, prebiotics, are very important in the metabolism. People think, oh, all germs are bad. Well, no, not all germs are bad. You need germs, in your body for you to live. And we probably have more germs than cells, quote human cells, and there's a symbiotic relationship between this microbiome that we have on the body and our metabolism. And if it's not in the right proportion, and if it's not in the right areas of the body at the right time, then you're not going to have proper health, and you start going down a disease path.
Right. And also there's the other aspect of it as well. And that is that it is our unfortunate state as thinking animals that we react both socially and inappropriately to thought. So you have a guy with a big dominant personality swearing, jumping up and down and saying that it's not a virus, it's an exosome. And you will get a certain amount of following for that. If a critical mass of that following comes along, then all of science can flip, perhaps inappropriately, and simply because of a thought process, not because of necessarily of anything that's evidence-based or even pragmatically proven to be practical.
Have you researched anything about Smith modernization of 2012?
Yeah,
A little bit.
Yeah.
See, my concern here is what's going on for this particular crisis, this pandemic that we're in, is that there is forced misinformation that's going on to try to divide, quote, the alternative, the alternative movement that we're seeing on YouTube and these social platforms, where it's like free thought, we're asking a lot of questions, but there just seems to be characters that are coming in, and they're targeting specific cohorts of individuals on YouTube, and they launch their ideas on like Richie from Boston, where it's just like, the flat earther,
Sure,
and
sure.
and then all of a sudden Dr. Kaufman comes in, gets on Richie from Boston, and says viruses don't exist. And so
Yeah,
now you
yeah,
have 800,000 people
yeah.
that
I was
are
gonna say, tell
attacking.
that to tomato
Yeah,
plants.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
I
yeah,
mean,
yeah,
it's like any farmer can tell you that
yeah, yeah,
viruses exist.
yeah.
So I mean, it's just weird. And in
Well,
the
no, it's not.
background
Okay.
that Dr. Kaufman has, you would think that he would have been at least exposed a little bit to germ theory to get through
Right.
medical school. You know?
No, he's a psychiatrist, which means
Yeah.
basically they try and ignore anything about the body because they're convinced that their paradigm is correct. They worship as their god this fellow that was a cocaine and morphine addict and died of
Right,
cancer
right,
of the esophagus from smoking 33 cigars a day, and his name was Sigismund Shlomo Freud.
right.
And it was all promoted by the Tavistock Institute. So I don't have any respect for psychiatrists. And the fact that he's a psychiatrist tells me that I actually have more authority as a surviving cancer patient in speaking about any aspect of the body and health than he ever will have, unless he has some other claim to authority other than his education as a
See,
psychiatrist.
I've always viewed from since I was maybe in my 20s. I'm 47 now, but ever since I was in my 20s, I've always viewed that people have gone through cancer as the experts
Yeah.
because they intimately know what it means. People can read about cancer, people can study, cancer in the lab, but you don't really know it unless you're in it. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Until
And
you
it's like,
die of it. Right. Right.
you know,
Yeah. 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 No, and it's just like with anything. Once until you get on the mat with it, you just don't know. Right.
right,
It's
right.
what is it? There's in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice, there sure as fuck is. So
Right,
yeah.
right,
But hey,
right, exactly.
let's get back to the
Uh,
whole flat earthers for a second, okay?
yeah, yeah.
Because here's something I found out. In the process of the last 5 months or 6 months of my poking at reality, I apparently poked on some people that I should not have relative to social media and stuff. And I got a lot more dissonance and blowback coming my way than in previous years. And so I've had run-ins before with, um, Twitter and these kind of things, but I've never ever been put in any kind of a Twitter jail. Because I was a linguist, I was always very careful. I knew which words to use, which ones not to, how to phrase it, etc. Never had any problems, never kicked off or any of that. And then I start getting involved with calling or describing the situation a specific way, and there's all kinds of problems. Now, I run my own servers, always have, right? And so as a result of which I got my own email server. I know it intimately. I know what's going on with it. I know its DNS flow and the traffic flow and all of this sort of thing. And I've been hit over the course of this period of time with a number of attacks that I can prove came from China
Mm,
via very specific routers, some of which actually end up coming up through VPNs on the East Coast of the US. But in any event, I noticed that some of these identifying IP origination addresses have been included in the in the source of new support for such channels as Richie from Boston,
really? Wow.
yeah, as JSNIP4, as David Wilcock, and I suspect it's the CCP. And what I suspect they're doing, because I know of one company alone that has 10,000 sliced IPs. So they've got IP addresses in clusters that are slicing for 10,000 workstations. And so off of a T1 trunk line, okay? Big telephone line, basically
Mm-hmm.
allowing them to get 10,000 people high bandwidth. And so they're a troll organization. And I know this organization is Chinese, it's owned by the Chinese, it's run out of China. You can tell where it's coming from in the telephony backbone. And lots of these guys are providing supporting positions and supporting comments and upvoting and all of this, all across all sorts of social media, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, you know, you name it, anywhere there's an interaction or a comment to be made, these guys are doing it, and they're scattering them all over such channels as Richie from Boston. And I think all they're doing is simply trying to promote anything that might, they're throwing spaghetti at the wall to see which color is going to stick, and then they'll throw more energy at that one, right?
Right. It's they're trying to divert attention. They're trying to divide the consensus within this alternative world that we're living in and on YouTube. So I agree with you. There's something wacky with what's going on with Richie from Boston and some of these other channels, and they always launch their crazy theories on, you know, on these things. They don't start small. They always, like, all of a sudden that's why I'm wondering if it's a CIA operation.
No, the CIA
like, and Kaufman.
Yeah, Kaufman, I understand, but the CIA's playbook may be involved without them necessarily being there. You know, everybody's watching the CIA. Point. You know, even I replicate what they do.
Right. That's a good point.
Yeah. And they just find the useful idiot, and, you know, they like what he's saying. They don't have to create any of this. They only have to promote. And it's so easy to promote now because Google and these other pay systems support it. So they actually can support your channel through simple view farms and super chats. And you just keep going because you're incentivized to continue in the same subject matter. As soon as you start getting off in the subject matter, the super chats go down, the views go down, so you go back to it. And it's a real simple process to train the human mind there to do what you want it to do. And that's exactly what's going on with these things. So you find a tendency to concentrate on the message that they want to support. And you know, if they did an audit, how much of the money coming through advertising, how much of the money coming through super chats is coming out of China?
Interesting. Now, as we kind of pivot towards the coronavirus or the Wuhan virus or the CCP virus or the Fort Detrick / Wuhan virus, whatever, what's your kind of like unified field theory of what's going on? You know, as we're getting more and more knowledge, you know, what do you think is happening here?
I don't try and answer why questions just yet. All right. So I do retroductive analysis. That's like what the police might use. They find the body, so they know there's been a crime. And then they try and find out how it was done, who might have had an opportunity, who might have had a motive, who might have had the means. And then basically you use that and you work your way backward. I came into this at the beginning of the crime. Okay. I came into it when I was basically looking at the body dead in Wuhan, with the principal players showing up and staring at the body.
What date did you start it? I started on January 25th.
Oh, no. I first started getting involved with this probably November 17th really or 18th. Yeah, November 17th or 18th. See, okay, because of my computer background, I do a lot of my computing on the deep web, all right? And I was trying to do some experiments because my mind is now sharp again. I was trying to do some experiments with my old technology and do deep web scraping and then analysis of what I was reading in order to get around the censorship issue, because censorship bogged down my process for predictive linguistics. And I was just noodling around. I'm retired. I don't need the money or anything. But there was just something in me that said, well, let's go and play with it. It was really raining and terrible here for the winter. And so on like the 16th or 17th of November, I was messing around. And one of the things I decided to do was to try and play around on the Chinese deep web, because that's where, okay, so lots and lots of the Chinese computer literate people, or everybody's aware that they're monitored on the internet in China, that everything they say is captured and so on. But a lot of people there know how to use Tor, the onion router, and how to put stuff out on the deep web. And they do that because if you're careful about it, it's not easily able to be tracked back, if ever. And a lot of them are aware of it. They think it is reasonably safe. So they actually have a Chinese deep web that proportionally was perhaps as great in daily postings as North America non-commercial internet. Okay, so people in China, there were so many of them posting on the deep web that it equaled how much all Americans posted online every day. And
Wow.
this was, yeah, just massive. Most of it is, it's not indexed. You can't get at it. It's a tricky situation. There's all kinds of perils to get into it. But I was down there looking at data and stuff, and I came across these reports that were just really puzzling because I couldn't figure them out. And I'm intrigued by the outliers, being in the woo-woo business all these years, right? And so the first reports I came across uh, basically were about this individual, or were from an individual who was complaining, and it wasn't a complaint because there was no way to address it at that stage. It was a venting of grief and rage by a man whose wife had just died. She had died because he could no longer afford to pay for this ECMO machine, or EMCO, whatever it is, right? The outside the body oxygenating machine, right?
It's the ECMO. ECMO.
ECMO. Okay. And so here he was in a hospital in China, in Wuhan, and his wife had died because he couldn't afford to pay for it. Now, this was my first interaction with Chinese form of socialized universal healthcare. I didn't know they had to pay for stuff as they went along, right? So I was kind of shocked, and I learned a whole lot in this little article. You have to understand, or in this posting, they're not articles. You have to understand that I don't read Chinese natively. My ability with Chinese is somewhat limited. I do understand many Chinese characters in ancient Chinese, but not simplified or modern. And it's dangerous when you're on the deep web because you're going through VPNs, and you don't ever want to leave your MAC or UDP address out there available, because then you can be tracked back. You can't do things like easily, like do a screen capture and take it over to Google Translate, right? Because when you do that, the transfer to the Google Translate, the bringing up of the JavaScript swaps things at a core level within the software that then exposes your machine to anybody with the acumen to be able to get at it the next time you go back on the deep web, right? And you're doing it second by second. So you got to be really tricky about it. So it's tedious beyond understanding. And so, but in any event, so I was able to translate this guy's he wrote in simplified machine, what I call machine Chinese, and was saying about all this stuff about his wife. It was a horrid story. I mean, it just left you weeping. It was just terrible. And it told me so much, but I didn't understand at that day what it was that had caused the situation, but I was quite intrigued because the way that this guy reported it, it wasn't like he was there alone with his wife, like I might be here with my wife in an otherwise healthy society, because just the few hints that he was describing about what was going on in the hospital, about the chaos with the doctors, about fighting to get the machine, and how he had to say, well, she's pregnant, you've got to do it, and so on. And how it literally had bankrupted him, his parents, and all their cousins, just paying for it for the 18 days she had been on it. And I thought, holy crap, 18 days on anything in a medical facility is outrageous these days, right? And that's when I started becoming alarmed. And then it just went on. And then over the rest of November, I was sort of noodling around with other stuff because I didn't think there was, and then around the 9th of December was when I knew absolutely that I needed to get my act together, but I needed confirmation before I could tell anybody, because there was no point in me screaming my head off about bioweapon if indeed it was going to be contained to China, right? If they were going to get a handle on it. But I knew on the 9th, when Xi Jinping made this weird speech, that they knew that there was a bioweapon out, and then I'd seen in between, I'd seen all these weird reactions, okay, on the deep web. So like in the latter part of November, so I don't remember the date, it was hectic, okay, once I really started getting into it and delving into it, I was, I still have to do all my chores and stuff around here, but I was spending maybe 8 or 10 hours a day on the deep web with this tedious process, looking and translating this stuff, right? And, but I came across these photos, and it was the weirdest thing I'd ever seen. I was used to the Chinese Communist Party and their posturing, And so I recognized what I was looking at, but the wording in it and stuff was telling me things. So I would see these photographs of all these workers, all these Chinese workers waving happy flags, right, given to them by the government. And they're standing out in front of semi trucks, and the semi trucks are loaded with all these cases. And some of them are the IBCs, the international bulk carriers, but most of them were standard size boxed pharmaceutical containers. And so I was looking at these photographs of these semi-trailers, and these things are all wrapped up with, they're going to haul them some long distance, so they're protected with the plastic. And then there's banners in front of them. And the banners, when I would finally get around to translating them, would say something like, workers of production facility and some number in some place in China are proud to have accomplished 1,083 cases of L-ascorbate being sent to the great people's battle against, and then some word I couldn't translate, that did not translate, which later on translated to coronavirus.
Wow.
So they knew then.
Yeah.
And I was seeing photographs. These photographs were being put up there by people that were in attendance at the time, taking photographs of all of the workers because they worked in these L-ascorbate factories. And it wasn't just one factory. There were lots of these photos. And so I thought, what the hell is going on? And these were specifically getting these packages ready for fighting this whatever. And I thought, holy crud, what is it going to be? At first, I thought it was civil war. Is there some kind of unannounced civil war going on in China? What's happening here? And so, as I say, it got me concerned over the course of December. And then I started telling people in December. I started making my own plans in December. I got my in-laws freaked out in December, jumping up and down saying, you better get your act together. There's some serious shit here. I had run into a situation in late December. It finally dawned on me. I got a contact in Wuhan. I went back to my original contact method for him, which was deep web in these sort of, you can call them a drop box, and it's sort of an envelope box where you put in a message, and if they respond to it, it's always kept on that same server, encrypted and so on, doesn't transmit. And so I put in a message, and I would check back every couple of days. I finally got a message back from him. Maybe the 10th or 11th of January. I'd have to go back and look at my notes. And that was when I had the second key. So when I saw all of the photos of the trucks of the semi trucks, the trailer trucks with the L-ascorbate crates on them, I also, in maybe, let's say 5 days, 6 days, something like that, started seeing military or postings of documents being issued by the Chinese People's Liberation Army that were requisition forms and purchase orders for vast quantities of vitamin C and some vitamin D and a few other substances. And so these were also put up by whistleblowers saying basically to their own people, what the hell's going on? Why is the Army suddenly buying out our entire factory's production of L-ascorbate for the next 5 years, right? And they want us to produce, and we've got to get it on trucks and so on and so on. And so everybody's starting to freak out in China that wasn't in Wuhan, wasn't in Hubei. They were all over the place, and they were getting involved in the end of November. And then stuff happens. We get to the end of December, and on Christmas Day, I see this, that evening, I see a video with an accompanying still photograph. And it's from a guy who's standing in maybe the second, third, or fourth floor. He's taking the video on a camera, on a smartphone. He's taking it obliquely down a street. So he's looking out this way in a cornered kind of a view from his apartment. And you're seeing, because of his height, you're able to see a fence, you're able to see a crane, you're able to see these people welding the fence gate shut. You can see part of the sign there that identifies it as a PLA Navy base. And you can see the crane is lifting up these semi trucks with the L-ascorbate on them, as well as other supplies, and setting them on the base. And people in funny looking gear that I now recognize as PPE gear are running out and grabbing all of this stuff and taking it over and hosing the crap out of it. And so, and I didn't know what was going on. And then later on, maybe in January, I rewatched that video and saw, because it was still available, and saw way in the background there was a submarine. And so, or what I take to be a submarine sitting next, floating next to a dock, right? The bulbous, depreciating shape of the stern of a submarine, and what I thought was a fin. So anyway, at that point, of course, in early January, I'm majorly freaked out. I'm starting to say bioweapon was released because it had been confirmed to me that my initial supposition that had been confirmed in December was true, that the Chinese had a bioweapon release. They knew it was a bioweapon at the time it was released. And this explains Kaufman, by the way. We can divert to him real quick. One of Kaufman's only only reality hinge for his theory is the only peg he's got for this is that the Chinese didn't have, in his mind, quote, enough time to have discovered the virus, purified it in order to be able to sequence it, in order to be able to make a test for it within the timeline as it lays out. That's his entire reality hinge if you read through all of his stuff.
Right.
And he's saying it could not have happened. Ergo, he says, they just grabbed something and decided that was the virus. And what they grabbed was an exosome. This is his supposition. And he's not using retroduction here, because he is correct. Under the normal circumstances, they could not have had enough time to get to that point of making a test. But they didn't have to, because they knew exactly it was a bioweapon and it had escaped from a lab. So they had it
there's
sequenced.
Lots of literature that goes all the way back, to 2008 or before, that shows on how this was slowly being developed, at least at the scientific level, and then it bifurcates into a weapons program. Once they realized the gain of function that they were able to achieve in the lab. And then
no. Hey, no. It splits earlier. It splits earlier than that. It splits a year.
What year do you think it splits? I thought it was around 2014, 2015.
Okay, I would have said early 2014. And the reason that I would say that is because at that point, right up to that point, there was a series of articles by these, what I think of as the usual suspects, okay? These Chinese and non-Chinese authors putting out papers on their research on horseshoe bats.
Right.
And then, and then one group of them, then there's this final article that was out in like 2013. And thereafter, there's a whole series of articles, but the usual suspects drop off. They start not producing as many articles. And in fact, they don't produce anything from like 2015 onward. Okay, so they were co-opted into the weapons program. But here's the thing. They had someone continue some aspects of that research, and then they just let it peter out. It was designed to cover that they went underground with it. Okay, they had that planned. Okay, now what they discovered was these guys discovered that there's this structure, this GULO structure, that is a precursor. I can't remember the whole scientific name of it, okay? Because I got so deep in it, it's just all blurred in with all the other virology stuff. But they discovered it in the horseshoe bats all right, so there's two mentions in one of the articles in dealing with what might be a throwback species, subspecies of the bat, because there's this old version of the horseshoe bat that used to make 3.5 million years ago, used to make vitamin C. All right. And they, like all fur-bearing mammals, it made vitamin C in the follicular mass at the base of the clear hairs. And so, but it lost that when it went into caves. Now, there was an article that suggested that a recent discovery of what they thought might be a retro or throwback to that species, because they thought they'd found a bat that made vitamin C. And that was their explanation for it. And so I thought, aha. And then they said, well, then there was one more article, this final article, which they said, well, we did find a bat. We sort of think it makes vitamin C, but not through the follicular mass, but rather through this structure called the GULO. And it's this glutathione, basically a molecular precursor method for assembling a vitamin C molecule. And then they stopped talking about it. Then they didn't talk about it at all. But they talk about other aspects for another couple of 4 or 5 articles about this throwback species. And so I started looking at it, and then I started analyzing it, and I said, well, wait a second, I can't find any more articles by these guys that had written this original one. What happened to them? And so I started looking at what they weren't saying in all of the previous ones. And I made some retroduction conclusions that they found a subspecies of bats that makes vitamin C. It makes it in burst, which is very important later on, with very low light. It makes incredible amounts of vitamin C in bursts at very low light. And the burst mechanism is just incredibly deep into this whole paradigm of how this virus works. And then they found out that it makes it on demand as it needs it. It does not store it. That's why bats are thought not to make it. And probably all bats that are cave dwellers have this model, and we've never looked for it. So all bats probably make vitamin C, and we just are totally ignorant of it. Again, our thought process, screening us from what we think is true, or what is evidentially true, but just because we think something else is true. But it was just, this discovery of theirs was so powerful, it took them down this road, because it meant that what I was seeing in those trucks was that they had discovered that their bioweapon had a particular key that would protect people, because you don't want bioweapons to affect your own troops. The whole idea of a bioweapon is to be able to give it to the other guy and let the other guy die and perish or almost die, and then you revive the ones you want and don't revive the ones you don't want. I went to I went through the war college with my father in the 60s, doing a lot of his math, because he wasn't particularly well suited to math. And so I got to read all of the books and stuff. It was boring in Leavenworth anyway. And so I read the entire ABC at the time. It was the atomic, it wasn't nuclear, but it was the atomic, biological, and chemical curriculum for the USA War College. And the stuff about the biologicals was very interesting, and especially now that we're living it. And I understand that what's going on here. So as soon in December as I saw the vitamin C being loaded in, and then certainly by December 25th, when I saw them welding in the submarine guys with vitamin C, I knew that they thought that was their last desperate hope for those people. And so that told me that there must be some level of that was a key to this particular virus. And then over the course of time, following all the progression of what the doctor reports were on the deep web from Wuhan, because they started piling in there, especially after Lee disappeared. And then ultimately he died.
Dies, right?
Yeah, but they really piled in there. And so it became obvious to me, based on what I was reading, that we were looking at 50 milligrams per kilogram of body weight as being the key that the Chinese thought was effective in keeping the
wait, let me get that straight. Wait, let me get that straight. 50 milligrams per kilogram?
Per kilogram of body weight daily was the key. Wow. that they thought was absorbed, was the key that they thought was required. Now, there were other numbers in there, okay? And I'll explain in a second why all this is pertinent. So that comes out to 22 milligrams, or 22 milligrams per pound, right? And anyway, though, but to treat it in Wuhan, the minimum effective dose was 100 per kilogram, okay, injectable every 6 hours. And it sometimes on obese patients, it was required that they go up to 200 every 6 hours, 200 milligrams per kilogram every 6 hours. But they had recovery at that rate, usually recovery in 10 days. So they had other people that were on all kinds of systems and stuff through all of December, all of January, and were not doing well at all, even into February. And then they would start the process of giving them massive amounts of vitamin C along with whatever else they were doing, and they would recover within that 10-day period of time. Now, I've shepherded a number of people through this, and the vitamin C and the vitamin D is really critical, and it'll cut the severity state way down from weeks to mere days. And I think it also reduces the potential for damage. And I think I understand why it reduces that potential for damage. But there's some other numbers that came out about this. There were 2 doctors in Wuhan, probably neither one of which are alive at the moment, but they were discussing the idea that it was a combination of having a minimum, what they were thinking of was like caveman levels of vitamin D. Okay, so as an not inflammation, but an anti-infection signaling molecule, because the vitamin D is present in every molecule. It's active in the sinuses and so on, active at the back of the throat. And they were thinking that the one thing that really defined all of their patients in China that they had to deal with was that they were being brought in with exceptionally low vitamin C and vitamin D levels. And these were the two guys that were, one of the guys had done autopsies, and he had
See,
done.
what I thought the mechanism in these vitamin C's and vitamin D's and K2s, I mean, there's many different pathways that this thing could work with. But my understanding with D3 for being sick was that it was allowing for calcium to maintain in the bloodstream for downstream processes to help the immune system.
That would make sense because they were also supplementing with magnesium in order to maintain a balance. Okay.
And zinc. See, like
And
I've
zinc,
heard
and
that
zinc as
every
well.
time you're sick, you take zinc, you take
Yeah.
D3, you take
Yeah.
magnesium, you take lots of vitamin C, you drink lots of water, take garlic.
I don't know about that. Okay, see, there's the thing about garlic. You got to be careful with the allicin compounds. Yeah, it's antiviral, but not particularly so. It's more surface antiviral, doesn't penetrate. This was why chaga turned out to be really key, all right? Chaga is a polyform mushroom, extracts all of these triterpenes and other chemicals that are directly antiviral from the birch tree. But they are also massively loaded with zinc, magnesium, vitamin B, vitamin D, and vitamin C. And they provide vitamin C and vitamin D in quantity as long as they're held in the mouth. And I know from local natives here that use it that way as sort of a chew for anti-cancer properties, where they'll put a chunk in their mouth and work it all day. And then it might take a week for that chunk to be softened enough that they can crush it, and then they'll chew it and swallow it, right? And they've actually, you're still getting vitamin C out of it in the very end. So it takes forever to get all these nutrients out of the beta glucans. But in any event, so my guy in Wuhan, all right, so the guy I knew in Wuhan, I had known since 2010. I knew I was seriously ill in 2008 when my brother died, and I was trying to figure out what it was because I was getting no help from any of the doctors. And so I started turning to herbalism in a serious way, and I set about exploring all kinds of chemicals or compounds that were available for the symptomology that was presenting itself at the time. And at one point I got interested in desert-dwelling plants, and this one particular plant called cistanche. And I had there's two forms of it. There's the rare form, the specimen form, that's protected. You can't harvest and sell those and get them, export them, right? And then there's a cultivated form. And like all of the cultivated forms, just like cultivated mushrooms for medicinal purposes, they're different, not necessarily weaker, but they present a different complex of compounds. And I wanted to experiment with the original desert non-cultivated variety. And so that's why I found this guy in Wuhan on the deep web. And it turned out I needn't have found him that way because he was a licensed specimen plant collector by the CCP, and he was allowed to sell 12 cistanche plants down to their basal, what we would think of as their roots. They don't really have a root structure. They're a parasitical plant, but he was allowed to sell 12 of them a year outside the country. And so I just bought one. And so I'd known him since 2010, but I got hold of him originally on the deep web because I thought I was doing something that was basically illegal, right? Or prescribed in some way, and didn't want any trouble. And so I just bought some. We had a cordial relationship. He was a massively knowledgeable herbalist, age 69. He was a licensed to operate in the Wuhan hospitals TCM guy. He was like, had his certificate from the Chinese government saying you can go and practice, TCM medicine in these hospitals and so on. So he was intimately involved in this. Haven't heard back from him. I've had no contact with him since January, but he told me in January, he gave me his case history, and he said it was really weird. He said he asked in that last message, could this be a bioweapon? But he said that he had 13 patients that were in the Wuhan area, that were in the constrained circle, okay, the lockdown area. He was allowed to go in and out of the lockdown area. He lived to the west of it because he was a doctor and he had these patients and he was taking them medicines and stuff. Of his 13 patients, 2 of them died.
You still there? Hey, Cliff, I just lost your signal right when you said that. Cliff? Cliff? Wow, that's weird. Cliff? 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 Okay, we're recording again now. But right when you were saying, oh, someone died, it just cut off. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's
Well,
just,
see, Zoom and the Chinese servers. See, I've done these
man.
interviews. You may not, this may not go up on YouTube.
No,
It may not get
we'll
the
figure it
processing.
away. We'll figure it away.
Okay.
But the thing is, I've
Yeah.
had problems because I talked to Diamond from Oppenheimer Ranch quite a bit, and
Yeah.
every time we say something that falls
Right.
into a certain
It's that
category, it just
SS7
freezes up.
layer. Right. It's
Yeah,
the SS7 layer because it allows them to monitor the conversation in real time.
yeah, yeah.
It was
It's weird.
fascinating working in the telcos. But anyway, let me get back to that.
Okay,
Okay.
so it stopped right when you said they died. Okay.
Okay. So you had these 2 guys that had died. They were sports players. The sports player, they may have been soccer players. They were professionals. He was treating them for something else at the time that they then got the disease. So they were his pre-existing patients, as were the other individuals. So he had 13, 2 of them passed. They were his 2 young patients. All the others were 50 and older. His 2 oldest patients, one of them was a guy he was treating for cancer, and then he was treating the guy's wife to boost her up because the guy was like 73 and she was 74, or vice versa, right? And so they were a year apart, and I can't remember which one was older, but the husband had the cancer and the wife needed to tend him. So my friend here, Joe, was providing herbal support for her systems so that she would have, the strength and so on, right? The ATP support, basically. And so of his 13 patients, the only 2 that were not being treated with chaga were the 2 that died, because he wasn't trying to treat them for any of the conditions that he thought was linked to treatment by chaga: inflammation, cancer, even bacterial. He's treating one guy for a bacterial infection. The guy was a sewer worker or something and had a gash that was just not amenable to antibiotics, and so he was going the herbalist route, and Joe was treating him with chaga internally and in a very finely ground compound form on his leg to get rid of this bacterial infection. So he had 11 people on chaga, none of them sickened and died. Especially what was remarkable was none of them, and they were all prime candidates, especially the cancer patient and his wife. And he had been dealing with them and this disease all through December, and Cho was exhausted by mid-January when he replied to me, or early January, and had said that he was tired, that everything had broken down. You couldn't get transport anywhere. Food deliveries were shut off, and he had to walk or bicycle miles. He had to leave his bicycle with the PLA at the check stand and then walk through Wuhan to get to his patients. And he had to walk all around because he had to bring them the chaga, right? And none of these people were on vitamin C. So it was at that point in January, I thought to myself, okay, so what is it about the chaga that is working against the disease? And that's when there was the big flurry about the 2 Hindu graduate students that had sequenced it and briefly brought out that they thought they saw HIV inclusion in it. And I had maybe 20 minutes or so with their sequence that they had presented on the internet. I could see the HIV inclusion. And so I thought, okay. And then I instantly went to the NCIB database, put in for chaga and HIV, and lo and behold, hits all over the place. because it's one of the most investigated substances for HIV um, uh, treatment. Okay.
See, I
And
didn't know that. Wow, I'm
okay.
surprised at that. Wow, I didn't know
Oh
that
yeah,
history.
and it's used in Russia and all these other places as one of the components that they give you as an HIV inhibitor because it has no side effects. There's a history of use of
You know,
chaga
it's
for
interesting.
thousands
It's
of years.
interesting you say this because I came across a paper um, that was looking at terpenoids and lignoids to inhibit coronaviruses through the 3CL protease.
Exactly, exactly.
And, and so, they were looking at about 22 different compounds. So one of the compounds that's easy to get that someone could just go to a natural food store or Amazon is birch bark extract. That has a
Yep.
protease inhibitor capability. All right. Now, and I don't remember what number. I'd have to look what number within the paper that birch bark is, but if you could just let me know, because I'm not really familiar with chaga, that mushroom and all
Oh,
that.
hey,
What trees? It's
it
on
only
the
grows
birch tree.
on birch trees.
See, so
Chaga's
there's
been used for
yeah.
4,500 years that we know of, that we can
Now
establish in
this is
Siberian. I was taking
it,
chaga for 18 months prior to this because of its anti-cancer, because
this
that was
is
the thing that you get out of the Solzhenitsyn's book, The Cancer Ward.
yeah.
Okay, because when you go into the Siberian Cancer Ward, they in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, probably 70s and 80s as well, they would always have everybody drink chaga coffee because of it. None of the natives in Siberia who drank that ever got any kind of cancer. And so they could
Does it taste
recognize,
good? Does it
oh, it's
taste good?
great. Oh, I love it. I
Yeah.
love it.
Oh,
I just add chaga to my coffee. It's just great.
oh wow.
There's different forms
Now
of it. Now here's,
it makes total sense now because it's the birch bark extract and the chaga.
yeah,
There,
right.
that is
Well, there's
the
something else about that.
microenvironment.
Right. There's something else about that. As an herbalist, I can tell you, you can take birch bark, but not very long. It's very harsh. And for many people, it presents allergens that anybody that would be allergic to peanuts should be very careful about birch bark. Okay. Anybody that's allergic to shellfish should be very careful because birch bark itself is what is classified in traditional Chinese medicine as extractive or harsh as a substance. Okay. So it benefits you, but you pay a price in its use. So, I mean, all these things are categorized, all different ways to Sunday in various herbal traditions. But one thing that everybody as an herbalist should recognize as a practitioner is that all substances demand, even though they may give. And you want to have something that demands very little of you and gives a whole lot. And that's why the medicinal mushrooms are so good, because the medicinal mushroom concentrates all of the stuff out of the out of the birch into the chaga in a mellow form that's not harsh. I was taking chaga straight, easy 18 months before this event occurred, and thoroughly loving it because of the anti-cancer. I'm giving it to my dogs. They're very much more improved by it. The more I get into it, the more I'm in love with the stuff. The French had titled it the mushroom of longevity. The Siberians call it the immortality mushroom. It's just hugely protective and productive within the human system. One of the cool things about it is not only does it have vitamin C and all these vitamins and all the triterpenes and the lignans and so on, and it's just chock full of beta glucan, beta lutinic acids, but when it protects you from the COVID, it does it in like 4 or 5 different ways. So it's not only a protectant in the sense of hardening your body by giving you more vitamin C, it seems to marshal your vitamin C resources in a way that doesn't happen if it's not present. And in so doing, it's also presenting a combination of vitamin C and triterpenes available to kill the virus at the point that it tries to do the insertion. Here's the big thing about the COVID, okay, and what they learned with the bats. It's the virus. All virus work at a burst mechanism. All right, so they don't do mitosis and mitosis the way that cells do. They don't just divide and divide and divide and divide. Okay, so all virus are more mechanistic in the sense that they have all of these little chunks. And so the virus sits there and makes a little chunk, and it makes another little chunk, and it makes another little chunk, none of which are actually virons. They're simply components that will later on be assembled into a viron. And it makes all of these chunks until something tells it to start assembling the complete virus. And so this process is called a burst, because what it will do is there will be a latency period once the virus is introduced as all of these components are built, and then it has a burst of activity. And this is replicated at a macro level with the viral load that is killing the doctors and the nurses and the first responders. Because what's happening with them is that once there's a sufficient viral load, the virus attacks the cells. This is just what they discovered in Wuhan. The guy that was doing the autopsies noticed something very remarkable, that there was prior to the onset of multiple organ failure, it would be possible if the guy died from, say, a stroke. Okay, so he's got COVID. He's had COVID. They're getting him in there, but before they could ventilate him or anything, he passes away of a stroke. So there isn't multiple organ failure yet. A single point of something killed him, and they're able to determine that. Even those individuals would have localized scurvy in the throat. Why do they have localized scurvy in the throat? Well, because all the vitamin C had been drained out of those tissues. What did the Chinese discover about this virus? That the virus had been trained by the bat to continually sample for vitamin C levels, which triggers the bat to produce more, which keeps the viral load under control, which means the virus doesn't overwhelm the bat. So it has a particular interaction and strategy. I actually have been trying to get hold of Eric Weinstein, the evolutionary biologist professor, brother to Eric Weinstein. Brett Weinstein is the biologist. Eric is the mathematician quant. Okay, and I wanted to talk to Brett about this whole thing.
Are they related to Robert Weinstein? That's the cancer researcher at Whitehall.
I wouldn't know. Okay. Perhaps. I mean, they're brainy bastards, so it wouldn't surprise me, right? But I wanted to talk to Brett because he has experience with these bats, and he understands some of the things. And one of the things I discovered was the Chinese got up to the point where they were talking about this GULO on-demand vitamin C production stuff, and then there were a couple there were articles that I was reading that made no sense to me at the time. On the deep web and from China. And by the way, the Chinese chopped off the deep web access on 11 o'clock a.m. March 1, my time, Pacific Coast.
Oh, really?
That, they shut it off totally. All access to Chinese internet now goes through these mainframes and is 100% controlled no matter what you're trying to hit. The only way I can get anything in or out is to go through places, is to route it various different ways and pop up close, Vietnam or Korea, that kind of stuff, and try and get in through there. But it's very difficult now. But prior to that, I was reading articles about the vitamin C infusions working, about people that had vitamin C, about Chinese people as a whole, socially or culturally, are not supplementers. All right, there's very few cohorts within the Chinese culture that are naturally deliberately supplement. So they don't go out and take vitamin C. They may encounter the introduction of excess vitamin C into their system through an herbalist that gives them plants that contain it, trying to treat some other condition, but they're not, as a rule, going to take vitamin C to prevent that condition. And when they did, it was always for, rhinovirus kind of things, brief, emergency kind of things. And so not really consistent and so on. So they were primed for this, and they lived in a hugely polluted environment that destroyed their ability to manufacture and retain vitamin D. And vitamin D has such a low half-life in the system, that turned out to be one of the key criteria as well that the doctors discovered. But anyway, the localized scurvy in the throat, the guy kept saying that he kept seeing the scurvy in the throat, but initially when he saw it with multiple organ failure, he saw scurvy throughout the entire body. And it wasn't that the whole body had scurvy. It was that your liver would show signs of scurvy, or parts of the intestinal mucus lining would show a scurvy condition, and some parts of the skin. And you note now that we've got these people showing bumps, okay? Skin bumps is part of especially children. Have you heard that?
I haven't heard the bumps. I've heard of the discoloration of the skin.
Okay, it's the same thing. Okay, the discoloration in the skin, little tiny areas, not the whole body discoloration that struck those guys, but
right.
Usually
This
on
is
the
usually feet, like the toes, the fingers,
Correct,
the very
correct.
first part of the fingers. Yeah.
Okay, and so here's what's going on. If we examine those individuals, I suspect that a lot of them will be pre-metabolic syndrome children. Okay, children that have restricted blood flow into the extremities anyway, due to not having a particularly good diet, not having been able to maintain good vitamin kind of stuff. Because the Chinese were talking about this as well, and that was a pre, or not pre, but an ancillary, not often seen scurvy condition. So if you go back and you look at scurvy,
because there's this debate. The question is it like the scurvy model that you're talking about, or is it that it's the virus is attacking the peripheral nervous system? And people don't realize, but our peripheral nervous system will go all the way up to the surface of our skin. That's how we feel, right? And that it's attacking some of those nerve endings. But this is an interesting thing. I think you're correct that it's probably more of the scurvy.
I don't know that they would be mutually. I don't know that they'd be muchually exclusive.
That's a good point.
Because it could be using the sampling of vitamin C stuff. This also explains, by the way, why the gain of function that was imposed on this with relative to the blood cells is also so virulent, right? And it also, I think, explains the type of what they call the ground glass opacity. If I'm correct about that, the ground glass opacity could be mostly retrieved. You could recover from that. And the way to do that would be, what are the name of those?
See the worry that the ones, the allopathic ones, the MDs and the nurses out there,
right.
They're saying that there's so much fibrotic scarring because these air sacs, they're destroyed, literally destroyed. So I'm not so sure that these individuals, it depends on where you are in the clinical presentation, but I'm talking about the very severe case where they're like on death's bed.
Guy, look,
I'm not so sure.
Okay, now I'm just saying that if you're not if you're through with the progression of the disease and you have the ground glass opacity damage to the lungs and otherwise you're walking around, I think that can be recovered. But we would have to say that this is the progress of the disease at that point, okay? Because you can probably get it again repeatedly, and that's why it's so terrible. This is a bioweapon, so there is not going to be immunity, and the stuff we know about it does suggest we can recover individuals, that they could rebuild their lung tissue. And I say that because I know of people that, they say, the allopaths say, oh, well, the cellular walls are intact, but the areolar sac has ruptured itself. Okay, but I know people, that myself included, that have had massive scars where you had just huge amounts of scar tissue for whatever reason, for being sliced with knives or something, right? And you can make do things to cause the body to undo all of that scarring and remove all that fibrosis. And so I've actually had reports of people that were taking chaga prophylactically that are telling me, oh, hey, this lump on my head is gone. And it's because chaga is an anti-tumor substance, right? It'll actually, and I know of one guy.
I know you've said this in at least tangentially. There's something magical about C60. When I start taking C60, like within 2 weeks, I take it every day, but within 2 weeks, I start breathing better. I could get a deeper breath in my lungs. And it was weird. I didn't understand the mechanism. I understand the idea that, it's a super antioxidant, it eliminates ROS and all that, but I felt
Apoptosis too.
personally, I felt personally better lung condition.
Yeah, I live out here on the coast, and so I've got really good wind, air, lots of negative
Hmm.
ions and stuff. So I love going, just
Hmm.
really sucking it in. The C60, I think one of the real reasons that it provides that pop there, as well as in the eyes, is the apoptosis. Okay, it kills off all the senescent cells, and so your body gets rid of this waste material that it's just carrying around. That's
It stimulates those stimulates this, the adult stem cells, and then you start
correct, massive.
rebuilding. You're remodeling, but it takes a while to
Yeah,
remodel. And that
it
could be the
takes years. Yeah,
mechanism.
yeah.
That could be the
That's another
mechanism
mechanism. Yeah,
to reverse this
I've
fibrosis.
been talking to Ken Schwartz about that, right? About the rebuilding and using C60. Because see, if I were gonna, here's the thing, guys. So many of these people are acting like idiots. I mean, we might as well just come on out and say it and offend them because they're never going to talk to me anyway. But look at the people, for instance, with the Princess Cruise Line. Here they've got an ideal situation. They can turn their entire business model around. And all it takes is a single thought. They've got all of their machines idle and all their people laid off and so on because their boats are all contaminated and people won't want to go on cruises. Well, all they have to do is to reconsider what they want to offer in the way of a cruise. And they could start off with a small little cruise boat somewhere and offer a recovery cruise for people that we know to have been sick with this shit, right? And you put doctors and nurses on there, you pay them well, you pay the crew well. But my way of thinking is, and this is why I didn't think it would work with compliance, wouldn't work with a private company, is that you would make people show up there for this cruise, take the optimal level of all of the damn vitamins every day, take chaga every day, take all of these various different precautions and learn about this stuff to become well, right? But you can do things to recover the lung tissue. I'm quite convinced of that. It'll take a year perhaps, but in when I was in Germany as part of as a army brat in the early 60s, there were still people that were recovering, German citizens that were in recovery mode from lung damage that they had had 15 years earlier in World War II. And, but they were getting better each and every year. They were progressing and so on. And they didn't have anywhere near the understanding that we do now of how to rebuild tissues and what can be done that way. So I lost, well, let's see, I was down to 138 pounds total weight, but with a very high BMI because the cancer had forced me into a vegetarian diet. And so I'd packed on all kinds of fat, and I'd come down to 138 pounds when they weighed me just before hauling me into the surgery. Actually, the 138 pounds was 2 weeks before, so I'd probably lost a bunch before that, or in between then and the surgery. But from that 138 pounds, I've been able to restore myself up to now 161 pounds, pretty much fighting weight, and it's all muscle mass. My BMI is very, very low, 21, maybe something like that, right? And it's because I understand, especially after all of these years of study, trying to heal myself, I learned all these techniques, incidentally, that are now very valuable in our current situation. And one of them was to be able to recognize the bioweapon to begin with, but then also to understand that there were several keys out there lying around. And the combination of the keys of vitamin C and chaga is really spectacular. Those individuals that have had this disease at a severe state, that have talked to me via email or chat sessions or online while they were ill, in the course of when they were able, in the course of those 3 terrible days that most of them would go through, were telling me about their experience at a level that I understand and can interpret. And so they were telling me that, oh, well, one of the recommendations I made to them was that they would bomb it. As soon as they knew they were sick, they had to get on top of it. You can't ease into this. You had to totally bomb it, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so I would have them take 40 and 50,000 units of D, and sometimes 2 and 3 of those over the course of their first few hours of this. I would have them take 2 milliliters every hour of dual extract chaga in hot water. Could be hot coffee, it didn't matter, but no sugar, can't have any carbs. carbs made people sick for 5 or 6 hours. When the carbs wore off, they were ever so much better until they had another carb session, right?
Mm-hmm.
This one guy told me he was fine. I told him don't eat sugar, and then he said, oh, he was fine. He had sweet tea, a French version of sweet tea, and he said, my God, he said that night, he said, you know, his girlfriend almost hauled him to the hospital. He was that bad.
Well,
but
not only
anyway,
that, I think what happens is that insulin activates cells to bring in through the GLUT receptor glucose. Well,
right.
it's probably also a mechanism to bring in more viral products.
I was just going to say the glycoprotein. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Never thought of that part of it. I was thinking about promoting the Prevotella bacillus, you know, which is another thing that the Chinese had figured out here. In the Chinese, in the deep web, in those articles that were out, and maybe it's still available in like NCIB, I don't know. They were talking about this interrelationship of this, of the viruses and the Prevotella bacillus in the bats. And there was one discussion about they could tell when a bat was going to die. So they were obviously working with live bats, but they could tell when a bat was going to be overwhelmed by the virus. And what they were doing was they were interfering by causing a delay in this GULO mechanism within the bat. So they were giving something that they did not name or did not translate to the bats that would cause a delay of up to 1.5 minutes of the GLO response. And the bats would be overcome by the virus and would keel over and die. And one of the things that they saw happen was a bursting again, this burst effect within the bat of the Prevotella bacillus at the same time that the virus was overwhelming, starting to get in and overwhelm the bat. And this bursting process, this is unique, I think, for coronavirus, in that, insofar as I can tell, rhinovirus, you get a little bit of a rhinovirus on your snout, okay? It comes on up into your sinus, it finds an area of your sinus that's cracked or in some way damaged, and it gets in and starts to attack you, and it starts to multiply, and you get a cold. This virus doesn't work that way, okay? This virus gets in your throat, and it's quite happy to just sit there in your throat, and if a Prevotella bacillus comes along, it will invade the Prevotella bacillus and extract stuff from it for potential replication later on. And then there is some trigger that relates to mass in some way when the virus within your throat knows that there's enough of it in there, it will start to attack the throat tissue. And when it attacks the throat tissue, the result, the evidence, is this formation of the scurvy symptomology, as the vitamin C is being used to destroy the spike proteins when the virus attacks vitamin C is destroyed. Another virus attacks, vitamin C is destroyed. Eventually, the scurvy condition breaks out. There isn't enough there, and then the virus, by that time, attacks that spot, totally overload, and you're shot. Now, if you're already lower in vitamin C, or you're in a position where, you know, you're in regular lights, you don't have regular vitamin D, dead doctors don't supplement, you know, that kind of thing, right? And you're a doctor, you're working, you're exposed to heavy viral load intake anyway, that process is going to happen much more severe and much sooner than if you did things to get rid of the viral load. That's why I'd come up with this idea based on the strategy the bats used, where the bats were using this on-demand vitamin C production to keep the virus in check. And so my thought was, let's us figure out a way to make vitamin C lozenges that will give you the correct amount of vitamin C and vitamin D continuously over the course of an hour with mineral support, zinc and magnesium, and you'll have it continuously down your throat, preventing this virus from being able to build up the viral load that allows it to attack you.
And see, you know, here's the problem with the lozenges, with most lozenges that are out there. People, you know, have a sore throat and they just put a lozenge.
Yeah.
You know, it has the fructose in it. Yeah, well, it has the fructose in it.
That too, yeah.
You can't have that. You can't have any of that sugar in there.
Right.
And take all that out. But I like the idea of this continuous
well, I'm actually working on it now with guys at Pure Bulk and a few other people. We're trying to come up with a formula that will work.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, and that would work for first responders. Then we could lower the the incident rate, right? And see, getting back to like the Princess Cruise, they could have get well cruises, right? They would just have a small cruise ship somewhere, and they could establish this as a pilot program. And then they could prove that this therapeutic approach works. If no one got sick, was worse, if everybody became more healthy, if their crews became more healthy, they could pay their crews to be compliant with the vitamin C and this kind of thing, and make everybody understand why they need to do it. But my thinking was that, really the route to go would be to get a Navy boat somewhere where they just tell the sailors, take it, and they would basically, then you would stop it dead. The thing is this, that the Chinese, through the deep web, I was able to get through from a connection via VPN to Vietnam. And you don't get much because they're screening everything, but there's a few areas you can still get into the China internet, but it's not like you can really get in there because you can't search. The deep net has no Google or any of that kind of stuff, right? But there were a couple of addresses I had, and I went and looked at a few things, and it was true that the Navy, the Chinese Navy, had some discussions that were being put on the deep web that I could translate, in which they were indeed gleeful over the fact that the Chinese Navy was not suffering the debilitating effect of the virus that all the Western navies were, right? Because at a boat, I'm a small boat sailor. Anything you do on a boat, from getting up to pee to the most complex cooking operation, is 35% more likely to result in an accident just because you're on a boat and it's moving around. And it's awful hard to maintain operational effectiveness on big boats. And once you lost a certain percentage of your crew, you're shot, because you're running into seasickness and all these kind of things, and the boat's moving and all that kind of stuff anyway. So running a Navy is very, very difficult. And so
on a small sailboat, how long have you been out on the seas?
We used to go for like
1 week or a
no,
month?
15, 20 days. There was one
Cool.
big trip we did across the North Atlantic. So from New York to Germany, in through past England and in through the North Sea. That was 42 days. It was a real beater too. I mean, we did it at the tail end of winter, got caught in a couple of low pressure systems, and these are in what we call 4-knot shit boxes. Okay, they just don't go very fast. They're single mono hulls. These days, all I would sail in is a cat or a trimaran, but in the old days. And so so I sailed all around, mainly in the time in the 50s and 60s when they were building the intercoastal waterway on the East Coast. We would sail out and watch them build the barrier islands, for instance, off South Carolina, when they were dropping all that material. So but as a small boat sailor, I recognized that the Navy would be the perfect test case for this. And that we have, and I'm certain that whereas I could not do it now, I'm quite certain that there are people that work in deep holes in the ground that would be quite happy to provide the Navy with copies of the stuff I saw from the deep web, because I'm sure they can get at it, whereas I can't, right? And the Navy would say, the Chinese are giving all their sailors 50 milligrams of vitamin C every day per kilogram of body weight, unless they're heavy, and then they give them 60. And other than having the runs the first week, there's no real problem with it, and everybody's healthy and they're operationally secure. And they don't have COVID outbreaks the way we do.
How much water do you think they need to be drinking, though, to make sure that they're absorbing this? Because it's water soluble. I mean, how much water do you need to drink with this massive amount of vitamin C daily?
It changes. Okay, so I take a lot of vitamin C. Okay, after I got through the cancer, so I had the cancer surgery in July. I have a really tough recovery. I'm riddled with infections. For the first couple of months, it's touch and go. And then in September, because bear in mind, I had, in the last 30 years, I've had 4 days off of my chores here, keeping everything running. And those 4 days were the 4 days of my cancer surgery and the 3 days recovery. As soon as I got back here, I had to start everything up again. So it was rough. Anyway, in September, I decided, okay, I got to do something. This isn't working. They assigned me to an oncologist, and I walk on in, and first off, I didn't have great faith in my surgeon. He was a good surgeon, but I wouldn't go to him for anything related to medicine because he's the Pillsbury Doughboy and he's going to die very young. He's probably 330 pounds, walking around, can't breathe
Isn't
right.
it amazing that most doctors are unhealthy?
And he's swigging down sodas all day. And the oncologist was no better. The oncologist's basic answer to me in the first 2 sessions I had with him, his fundamental response was, I don't know. When I would ask him something, he'd suggest doing a test. And I'd say, well, how's this test work? What's it going to tell me? And so on and so on. He'd say, I don't know. And so finally I just gave up with him. I fired him I got disgusted, fired him in late December, and had taken over the entirety of my care from that point on. But between September and December, I got deep into anti-cancer reading, okay, because I didn't ever want to get into cancer. It was nothing I wanted to explore because it's fraught with all of the issues of the Gerson therapy, all of the fakes and the frauds and the one hope fits everybody solutions and all of the bad understandings. But cancer at its core turned out to be relatively simple for me to overcome. So there's a particular test, a CAE test, which is this, or CEA test, this embryonic it's basically a test to see if you've got any cancer cells that are popping up in your blood. And you take this test, and 3 is the baseline. And if you if you had cancer and within the first year you get up to 21, it says that your cancer is metastasized to your liver. And so that's basically how they use this test. But the test is totally unreliable. The value you get changes based on the labs.
Is it measuring some sort of peptide in the bloodstream, or is it measuring actually?
It's a visual test. They're actually looking for specific kinds of what they would think of as cancer-related cells. So okay. This is the best they've got. And I was looking at this, and their solution too, by the way, was I kept talking to him, and he said, well, at some point my numbers in September were good. Almost everybody after colon cancer comes down to the baseline of 3 within 3 to 4 months. And thereafter you just watch it. But my numbers started going up. But I was still eating sugar thereafter because my body was so weak, and I'd been on a high carb diet that entire time and didn't change everything until that coming January. It took me a few months to read about all of this and understand what was going on, plus get my mind back. That was a big issue, right? I did a lot of herbal processes during that period of time, even though I was very weak and even though they pushed me close to the edge, in order to recover my mind so that I could think about these things appropriately. Once that started occurring, then things really started popping in. During that period of time, I got deep into Linus Pauling, the electron bond book. His quantum mechanics book is shit, but I also read everything he ever wrote about vitamin C. And then I discovered, he lives into his 90s, all of his critics die, and he's got 2 Nobel Prizes. So anybody that tells you that you don't live long taking vitamin C, demonstrably it wasn't true for him. So I wanted to see if it was not also going to be also true for me. So I started taking a lot of vitamin C. And at that point, I started feeling better. And so I thought, well, there's demonstrable evidence for me that this is going to work. And I plunged into it. That's when I got really serious. I'd taken chaga and stuff when I had the cancer, trying to cure myself, but it was so terribly anti-cancerous that it caused bleeding and all kinds of problems. And I just thought it was my body's reaction to the chaga, not understanding it was the cancer reacting to the chaga. And if I'd taken I think we froze. Still there?
No, I'm
okay,
here.
Okay.
I'm here.
Anyway, though, if I'd taken the chaga long enough, I might have experienced the ability to pass the lump. I've talked to a native guy here in the Ponderai area, a different tribe than is local here, that actually had colon cancer and had just kept chaga in his mouth constantly for about 2 years and passed a cancerous mass. A mass so large he was afraid, scooped it up, took it into the hospital. The pathology said, it's cancer, it's big cancer. And he said, well, at least it's out of me. But so anyway, though, so I'd been taking chaga intermittently. And then once I understood what was going on, I started rereading the cancer ward. The depressive part of having the cancer, your mind, you don't want to think about anything. And then trying to think about things that are negative bring you down into a deep place because you don't have the serotonin, and all of these other things are all interrelated. So it's unlikely, it was just very unusual that I had the key, the life force to plunge into the cancer ward while I had cancer, because it's such a huge just sharing other people's misery at that point doesn't do you a lot of good. Anyway, though, I read about chaga and I thought, hey, I'm through of it, but I'll take it again. And that's when I basically got up the courage and fired the oncologist, said, you people don't know what you're doing, and never looked back. Went and had the tests on my own. At one point I had 0. So the baseline was 3 and I had 0. Now at that point I'd been taking up to 5 and 6 grams a day of chaga. And it's not wise to take that much. You can get oxalate buildup in the kidneys. It affects the digestion and so on. But getting back to the vitamin C and the water issue, vitamin C is very interesting because there's a certain level of it that's required. If we go to the concept of the caveman theory that the guys were talking about, that the doctors were talking about in Wuhan, we find that our ancestors, the primates that actually make vitamin C, the primates that consume for vitamin C, and early hominids that were successful had vitamin C levels massively beyond what we have. In fact, now the best we can get, and vitamin D as well, and that's a big issue there. The best we can get for vitamin D now on this planet are lifeguards and surfers. Whole body surfers that don't wear wetsuits, right?
Right.
They'll have 64 nanograms per milliliter. All right. My doctor, my oncologist, I told him I'm going to start taking more vitamin D. I was reading about all of this stuff and it's starting to freak him out. This is back in like December. And I said, I'm going to start taking more vitamin D. I want to test for vitamin D. He says, oh, you don't have to test for vitamin D. You don't have to test for vitamin C. And I said, I want to. And he said, okay, I'll do it, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, so he said, oh, it's just where it should be. And I said, well, what is it? He said it was 14. And I said, 14 nanograms per milliliter? And he said, yeah. And he said, anything over 25 is toxic. Well, now we know that you need at least 40 to even be remotely ill.
See, here's the problem is that these doctors, they're not taught properly what the real levels of these, minerals and vitamins should be.
I'm at 70 now. I'm at 70 now, and lifeguards are at 64. Primitive cavemen and hunter-gatherers that exist on this planet now are 120, walking around with 120 nanograms per milliliter of vitamin D, and they don't get cancer and stuff. And so it became rather self-explanatory
sometimes they, because vitamin D is lipid soluble and it can be absorbed into your adipose tissue. So you can build up a toxicity. But here's the thing. When you're taking vitamin C and vitamin D, you'll have more energy. So you're not going to be building as much adipose tissue. So
there's another aspect.
There's a feedback loop where you're going to be more active.
Right.
But
another thing too is
that you're going to be not active.
Well, another thing too is they're plotting it against the standard American diet. So if you look at surfers and you look at lifeguards, one thing they are not, as a rule, is vegetarians. And if they're vegetarians, they're not vegetarians for very long because you need the fats and you need the proteins in order to live that lifestyle. So if you get to be into this seriously, you find that you lose fats like mad. So I converted a year ago in March to a total ketonic, 100% no sugar, less than 50 grams of carbs a day diet, right? And I increased my vitamin C at that point. I'm now consistently taking at least 6 grams a day. I'm taking my chaga. I'm still taking vitamin D, even though I'm going out and getting the sun. And the amount of fat on me is like minimal, is way down. My BMI is way down. And the impact of that as a concern is trivial. I mean, relative to all of this, I would much rather risk the buildup of vitamin D in fat tissue as opposed to getting COVID even once, right? But anyway, back to the water issue. Here's what you discover when you take vitamin C. Initially, you need a lot of water. Initially, it creates a bowel intolerance issue. But you can think of it this way because it's very apropos. As you take vitamin C in, let's just think of it as being used up in your body and going deeper and deeper and deeper into the body, the longer you take it. And once if we think of it this way, once you've taken vitamin C and it's penetrated and all your tissues up in your larynx are, for instance, completely full of vitamin C, they pass it to the tissues below. and they keep passing it to the tissues below until your entire alimentary canal has been saturated with vitamin C. And at that point, you have a correct balance of vitamin C and water. And thereafter, there's no longer any water issues because the ratio is maintained all the way through you, and you don't need to suck up the water to support the extra vitamin C being added to those tissues, if you want to think of it that way, right? So there's a ratio, as you were saying, there's this feedback loop. So initially you drink a lot more water, but then you become more hydrated, you have more energy, your skin is softer, you're respirating better, you're perspiring better, the whole cycle works better. And so the water is ever so much more efficient in you, and you don't need that extra quantity to try and compensate for taking the extra vitamin C. So it's a very nice feedback loop. Plus, chaga is an immunomodulating substance, okay? It's an immunoregulator. You can see in all of the literature about it. If you go and look, chaga is the most studied medicinal mushroom on the planet, and it continues to be so. Thousands of studies being run at any given time on some extract from chaga. And one of the things that you'll repeatedly see in the conclusions is, blah, 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 we don't know how it's doing it, but blah, 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 we don't know that, but boy, it sure does do it. And, and so you keep looking, and they don't know how it's an immunoregulator, but it suppresses cytokine storms, suppresses them to the point that they don't exist if you have enough chaga in you. And that's what these guys that were communicating with me when they had the severe cases of the COVID were responding to, when I would say, because I wanted to see, I didn't know if it's correct, right? Because I didn't get it. So because I'm hardened against it, I was likely not to get it. So I would have no personal experience about what it would be like to repel it. And so I was trying to gain some linguistic understanding, some emotional understanding from these people as to what it felt like to go through this, to see if my prescription was being correct. And so they would tell me that, well, the elderberry worked great. They were able to cough up stuff, so the cough became more productive. The Usnea was fantastic in that regard, and the Usnea provided vitamin C. Usnea felt cool to them in the fever. It provided them a coolness that floated out through their lungs, and the expectoration part of it was just the relief. The one guy said he was not able to breathe in the bottom third of his lungs, and this was the guy in France whose girlfriend was debating trying to take whether or not to take him to the hospital. But there were people dying in their hospital at that point. She didn't want to take him there, right? Anyway, though, but he said that once he got the Usnea in him as an extract, he started coughing up, he said, within like 12 minutes or so. And then he said he thought he was going to die because of the violence of the cough and the stuff that came up. But he said it was like a blockage had been removed. And he was able to breathe in the lower third of his lungs thereafter. And from that point on, the rest of the night, he felt very much better. In any event, though, they're telling me that when they take the chaga, that there is a heat that comes on, even if they've got the fever, even if they've got the chills, there is a heat that comes on that is not like a fever. And that this heat, in my description of it, is actually the antiviral component of the chaga coming in and doing battle with the viral load. Because
well, you know what I
feel
think
it
that
where they have damage.
I think the heat is actually the ATP production.
Could be indeed.
And it's helping fight. It's fighting, finding a way and fighting the pathogen. And if cells are compromised, it'll affect it'll affect your energy production, and you'll start having less ATP. So you'll get so I think that this heat that you're talking about is the body is saying, hey, I need to do a lot of stuff to fight this. And it's going in overdrive now, and it's just creating a lot of ATP to be able to fight this.
Well, it could also be creating the heat could be, I was thinking about it as being like a frustrated cytokine storm. Okay. So because they were telling me that the heat is not a whole body flush. The heat was specific to those areas, to weird areas of the body. So for instance, the one guy in the Netherlands was saying that it was in his liver. And he's not a heavy drinker or anything at all, right? And he did not take my anti-COVID cocktail, which I came up with, which turned out to be very, very effective. But he didn't take that, but he was taking the chaga, and he said, boy, his liver was just hot. And And he said at one point it was pulsating. And that we now know that that a lot of the people with the multi-organ failure die because the liver becomes very suddenly scarred, and it's through a scurvy, a kind of fibrosis in the liver that's caused by this. And so he very well could have had that condition down in there. And most of the other people are reporting that the heat's in the lungs, it's spotty in the lungs, it's in the back of the throat, can be up into the sinus areas, but it's not like a fever or those kind of responses. So I'm thinking that maybe it's an actual where the virus load is maximally being effective in the body, that for whatever reason, they are perceiving it that way. And the chaga is providing some kind of, like, let's say, master control of marshaling of resources. It's really interesting stuff. I mean, I've gotten deep into it.
I mean, the immune system, I'm working on a master's thesis at Harvard. It's dealing with actually TAT protein from HIV-1 to lower pro-inflammatory cytokines and increase anti-inflammatory cytokines for peripheral nervous system disorders, autoimmune system disorders that cause peripheral nervous system problems. So what's interesting is that this whole cytokine storm thing, there is this very pro-inflammatory response, but people don't realize that we have cytokines that are actually anti-inflammatory that try to calm that down. So it would be really cool to actually look at serum levels with chaga mushroom and assay it and see if the anti-inflammatory cytokines actually go up while the pro-inflammatory cytokines go down. So
well, I know that it's good against inflammation. I know that that's the case. Yeah. I'm surprised though if you're.
But like which ones? It would be very interesting to know which one of those interleukins are going up and which ones are going down, and the interferons, the concentrational levels for the interferons and how they're going down. So you got the INFs, you got the TNFs, you have the ILs. They all are in like an orchestra, right? Which ones are going up and which ones are going down? Now the ones that I'm looking at for the anti-inflammatory one for my paper are IL-4 and IL-10. But it'd be interesting to see if see.
Yeah, is the IL-10, is that the one that's arthritis? Is that the one that's found?
Yeah. No. If IL-10 goes up, you'll have less arthritis. If IL-10 goes down,
yeah, it was associated. Yeah. Well, I know that, taking the chaga, I've had all kinds of persistent medical conditions pass away. So a lot of my old scars are healing up. And these are scars I've had 40 and 50 years. So very interesting, right? Now, there's other stuff that I've learned about the virus and the bioweapon and cancer. And they all sort of relate because cancer is a opportunistic situation frequently, especially for colon cancer, is not a cell in your body that decides to become cancerous and starts growing. Rather, we can think of cancer in the colon as being, or anywhere within the stomach, from the stomach on, as being very similar to a virus. Maybe this is why it was frequently cited as being caused by virus, in that you can have cancer cells that float around in the biome and then they attach to the body. And it is when they attach and become a polyp. So the polyps don't burst out and come out of they can come out of the wall of your intestine on their own from a particular spot. And that usually is indicative of low vitamins, low minerals, SAD diet, and the whole thing, high sugar, high carbs, and also bad biome adjustment. But the more common kind, and the kind I had, is actually a cancer cell, a cell that becomes detached and off on its own and loses its central command connection and goes off and starts replicating, that then attaches and works its way through and actually penetrates in through the intercellular membrane within the intestinal wall and forms a connection to a blood supply. And it's from that point that you can get metastasization, et cetera, right? But prior to that, you cannot. And it's the attachment to the blood supply stuff that led me to the Linus Pauling and all of these kind of things, because the single largest indicator of healthy intercellular material is your vitamin C level. And so the vitamin C level within the body is a big indicator as to whether or not you can get an attachment through through a cellular wall. And as all virus and most cancers are obligate intercellular vehicles of one type or the other, if they can't penetrate that cell wall, you're basically hardened against them. And this is part of the thing. Vitamin C does that, but chaga mushroom also does that. The mechanism that chaga uses is really interesting, okay? Because chaga is black. The blacker the chaga, the more eruptive the chaga itself. It grows like a conch or something on the side of a tree. It doesn't have a veil. It's not like a usual mushroom. It's called a polyphore, which many millions of spore-producing outlets in it. And it's a cancer of the birch tree. Birch forests are really interesting themselves. In World War I, the French and the British surgeons preferred to do field surgeries in birch forests because people simply didn't get infections or at the same level as anywhere else. So if you were in a birch forest, because there was so much material around you that was antibacterial, anti-amoeba, and antiviral, you did not get infections anywhere near the same rate. So field hospitals were set up in birch forests all over France. And anyway, chaga mushrooms have this component to them that is black, that's truly melanin. And that component is regulatory within the systems for hyaluronic acid, which is the second largest component of intercellular and cellular membrane health. And if you have, so you can look all around the planet, you see all these weird sociological things, like certain people, don't get certain kinds of infections ever. And you see populations in Guam that never, ever, ever, ever get certain kinds of gut infections. And why is this? They have a diet rich in purple vegetables that happen to have very high hyaluronic acid. And so they have very tough intercellular cement binding all their cells together, and the cell membranes are very tough as well. And so this may account in a great degree for the fact that they're one of those longevity centers where people on Guam statistically live well into their 80s and 90s and very healthily, unlike many other people. So there's just all these weird interconnections. And turns out that chaga is deep into the hyaluronic acid regulation throughout the body. So I also take hyaluronic acid just to give it something to work with. And so, on those kind of things, it's like, this is going to tend to suppress the interaction with this bioweapon, which I'm certain I will encounter at some point.
Well, that dovetails right into a big question I wanted to ask you. As we get out of shelter in place in New York, I live in New York City, and we're about ready to get out at maybe May 15th. Is when they'll start letting us out of shelter in place. There's going to be a lot of people that haven't contracted COVID-19 disease, but there is a worry that there's going to be some sort of reinfection or another spike in infections in New York City sometime between when we get out and October. So what would you recommend in terms of vitamin C, chaga mushroom, for people to prophylactically try to boost their immune system to try to fight this pathogen?
Well, you've got to get at least 22 milligrams of vitamin C per pound of body weight absorbed. It's not that bad, okay? If you take liposomal vitamin C, you don't have to be eating ascorbic acid all the time. And so I only have to take 6 grams of liposomal, or 5 grams of liposomal vitamin C every day in order to get the vitamin C I need. With ascorbic acid, the cheaper, more easily obtained, I would have to take probably 12 to 14 grams a day. So basically, for every hour I'm awake, I would take a gram of vitamin C. That will surely flush you up. There's this process. You can go to orthomolecular.org, which is the site that was built around Linus Pauling's understanding of orthomolecular medicine, which is that your body cannot heal itself except by those chemicals already in your body. And the appropriate way to do it is to stimulate them. But anyway, they have all the metrics, and they'll tell you that it takes X amount of days to get completely flushed with vitamin C based on this body weight. whatever your body weight is, right? And so usually it's about 4 to 6 days at a level of 1 gram an hour, but you can't do that to start with because you end up with bowel tolerance hitting you. So most people take about 8 days to get fully saturated because they ease into it, get an upset stomach, back off a bit, go into it, and so on, right? But it's easier, I've discovered, to get large amounts of vitamin C in you if you also take commensurate with that large amounts of vitamin D. And so especially if you're in an apartment in New York, now I take 10,000 IU every day of vitamin D. And I'm out here on the coast. I spend at least a half an hour every day deliberately sunbathing.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing. I'm doing 5,000 in the morning, 5,000 at night. I take,
yeah. And it's nothing wrong taking 50,000 units. You make 125,000 units if you expose your torso to the sun for an hour, and you're a regular human, more or less, right? So at that level, we know we can create vast quantities of it. And vitamin D, our ancestors used to have it at the level of 120 nanograms per milliliter. And I had to work to get up to 70 nanograms per milliliter. And my oncologist, before I fired him, thought I was going to die the next day from vitamin D toxicity. And I'm feeling great. So anyway.
And that's the strange thing is there's a lot of oncologists, that are more on the edge. They've done experiments and have found good results with intravenous vitamin C.
Vitamin D and vitamin D as treatments to cancer. But get this.
It's just like, I just don't understand why these guys keep on saying it doesn't work.
Well, here's the thing. It's all that thought process. But I was trained real early in the software process because as a software engineer, you have to learn someone's business in order to create it in a digital form to make it into computer for them to work. So at one point I was doing work with insurance actuaries, and I was finding out all kinds of really interesting things. One of which was that the people that are most scared of the sun are dermatologists. The people recommending more sunscreen than anybody on the planet are dermatologists. The people with the highest levels of skin cancer are dermatologists. The people with the lowest level of vitamin D are dermatologists. So I always figured, dead doctors don't lie, don't do dead doctor stuff, right? Yeah. And so they don't like vitamin D, so I like vitamin D. They don't like the sun, so I like the sun. So I would do that. Okay, so let's get back to that real quick, just for finishing it up. I would do 10,000 units of vitamin D3 a day with K2 included in it. I would also
now the K2 you're using the MK4 or MK7. Do you know?
I don't know. I'd have to go look, to be honest.
Okay. The molecule that I use for K2 is the MK7, but that was more for heart. It was heart.
Okay, and I don't have those kind of issues, right? So I never even really thought to address it. But anyway, so 6 grams of vitamin C liposomal or 12 grams of ascorbic, and then the 5,000 units of vitamin D a day. And then I would also make sure I got at least a half a gram, and a gram is better, of chaga a day. Now you can get chaga in powder and make a tea out of it. You can get chaga in powder in a capsule and just take it, and you can extract from both of those. If you're going to make a tea out of it, you can reuse the chaga itself repeatedly in tea bags because it takes a long time to extract everything out of it. You can put chaga in your mouth as a little chunk, and just sort of like people would have chewing tobacco. You can get chaga as a dual extract. Now that's the most powerful if you have the disease, but you have to be careful of it if you don't have the disease, because the dual extract has a small amount of alcohol in it, so you'd be giving yourself a little bit of alcohol with it. But so there's a water extract, the powder itself, or the alcohol water extract. If you have the disease, the alcohol water extract is really powerful for flushing it out of your system. And some of these kids, and I say kids, they're probably in their 30s or 40s, that get it and have been talking about their symptoms on Reddit. Once they tumble to the idea of taking vitamin C and chaga, they say, boy, within a day, symptoms they'd had for the last month are gone. That's or great. Starting to go away. And the chaga appears to be the key there. They need both the vitamin C and the chaga in order to make it happen rapidly. And those people that have the disease, they even had severe disease, or had up to the point of severe, up to the point of almost going to the hospital, only had it for like 3 days if they had chaga in their system along with a lot of vitamin C. I've seen a lot of people around me that I know of now that have had it, that have been in their 20s and 30s, and have had it for 14 to 20 days very active, and then maybe another week beyond that in saggy sort of recovery, and are still limping along with some symptoms. And I'm thinking that they've all been damaged and need to really start actively working to rebuild their bodies. And there are things you can do to recover from this. But, and then like I say, I'm also really worried that everybody can get it again.
Right. Right, exactly. And that's why I'm really trying to promote on my channel that people need to be very proactive, even if you didn't catch it, that you have to be careful and you have to boost your immune system. And there's lots of people that are trying to educate, like yourself, you're educating people. And there are compounds out there that have been around forever that people can use and stack
safely,
and
right.
and safely use and and fight this and give yourself a fighting chance. Yeah. So I mean, I applaud you. You know, I've learned a lot. I mean, you know, and I've learned a lot about. I didn't know anything really about chaga.
I'm deep into the mushrooms because I used to use lots of psychedelic mushrooms. And so I became very convinced of the power of real drugs. That's also why I figured that allopaths don't know what they're talking about, right?
Right. But I mean, it's right. You know, you know, I think people like you sharing your experience, especially the cancer experience, and how you went through that, and how you blazed a new trail to heal your own body. People can learn from that and apply it to this particular situation.
Yeah. And that's probably one of the reasons that, you know, I was sent back, so to speak.
Right. So,
it wasn't a good cancer surgery, and the surgeon was deft, but you know, I still went through that crash. So I was due to die that day.
Yeah, I mean, but you're here, and that's,
you
know, you're here, you know, you're here, and
bitching and moaning about it too.
And do you feel, would you say that you have more vitality now?
Oh, certainly. Right. Yeah. Because there's I mean, especially the last 10 years of the cancer eating it away, right? Because here's the thing about cancer. So cancer is entirely sugar based.
Yeah.
Most people don't recognize it. All forms. But here's the thing.
Most people don't realize that it doesn't go into the Krebs cycle. It just stays in the glycolysis cycle. Right?
Exactly. And here's the thing. If we look at it one way, just as energy units, right? So if you've got a cancer in you, or if you don't have a cancer in you, and you take 2 grains of sugar, you're going to get 46 energy units out of those 2 grains of sugar. If you've got a cancer in you, the sugar still converts to 46 energy units, but your body only gets 2 out of those 46, and the cancer gets the 44.
Right.
And so that's what happens to you over time. As the cancer grows, more and more of your energy, and it keeps demanding more and more sugar just to get you up and moving. And so it's terrible.
And it's multiplying. Yes, it's multiplying. Yeah. It's an exponential function.
Yeah. So I have a lot more energy now. I'm 100% into the keto diet, carnivore diet, whatever you want to say. I just don't eat carbs. And actually, it's not true. I allow myself 4 dates a day for a total of 50 grams of carbs. And some days I don't have them, right? Some days, maybe a whole week will go and I won't have a carb. And then I might have a teaspoon of, or partial teaspoon of honey. And that's about it. But I have very much more energy. I'm waking up really damn early. I'm working solid until, that's probably good. 18 hours a day. And, I'm adding back muscle mass. I'm giving myself a challenge of with my lightweight bow, which has a 50-pound pull, of getting up to where I can shoot 100 arrows in a day.
Oh, great.
And so, so I'm now doing 33 in about 25 minutes. So I'll get there. And, tremendous amounts of energy now that I'm through the cancer. And also with the COVID, that's something else, is the energy drawdown happens so rapid. And, I mean, we've actually lost people that I know that to this disease, and they were young, they were healthy. One guy thought he had allergies and came out of it and walked around for 4 days and fell over dead. And massive, massive damage to his heart. And it was because he'd had massive ground glass opacities, and his heart was trying to push the blood just to be able to get him up and move. So really terrible stuff. I'm going to have to go. I've got to get another cup of
Okay.
coffee and stuff.
Okay.
But
Well,
nice chatting
thank
with
you.
you.
Thank you, Cliff. I really appreciate it. And if you would
Yeah.
like to come onto the channel again, we would love to have you because you have
Sure.
a
Sure.
wealth of knowledge and you're teaching us on how you went through your
Yeah.
cancer and how to apply it to what's going on. And we can go back and forth. Maybe you have a lot of knowledge about a lot of different things, and maybe we can even probe next time, maybe some geopolitical things.
Sure.
And maybe,
Sure. Yeah.
okay.
And we should
Great.
talk to George Webb too about the players,
Right.
because I
Right.
know the Chinese guys just by following all their articles.
Yes, what I'd like to do is maybe get a 3-panel next time between you, George, myself.
Yeah.
That would be really good.
Yeah.
So
Sure.
we'll
No
plan
worries.
that. Let me stop the recording here
Okay.
before